My name is Marcin Zaborowski. I represent here the Polish Institute for International Affairs, which together with the Polish Ministry for Foreign Affairs hosts this debate on Europe. It is a true honor to present our speakers. Let me just start with our distinguished visitor, Dr. Henry Kissinger. And really the best way to describe Dr. Kissinger is to say that he is the man who simply is the co-architect of the world we live in. A former national security advisor, a state secretary in the administrations of President Nixon and then Ford, Dr. Kissinger presided over major foreign policy initiatives that really has changed the structure of the world and the structure of the international system. Let me just mention here some really the most essential ones, which by no means exhaust the list of achievements. But perhaps Dr. Kissinger is best known for his role in forging reapproachment with China, which paved the way for return of China to the international scene and changed the balance of power in the Cold War. He's also well known for ending the war in Vietnam, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And last but not least, essential role in launching the arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, which certainly was one of the key factors leading to the end of the Cold War. So in many respects, we perhaps wouldn't have this debate today. We couldn't have debate as freely as we do had it not been for the activities of men like Dr. Kissinger. So truly, Dr. Kissinger, we are delighted to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to speak at our event. Dr. Kissinger will be debating with Minister Radosław Sikorski, who naturally needs no introduction here in Poland. Let me just say that Minister Sikorski's speech on the future of the European Union delivered in Berlin last year will serve here as one of the key reference points in this discussion. The debate will be moderated by Mr. Piotr Kraśko, a senior editor of the Polish public television TVP, and on this occasion I would like to thank the TVP television for co-sponsoring this event and for broadcasting it live. The subject of the debate is Europe, but I understand that we will also talk about the broader context in which Europe finds itself today, including its relation with the immediate neighborhood, including relations with outside powers such as Russia and the United States. Now, we are pressed for time, so let me end here. Gentlemen, I wish you a successful debate. Mr. Kraśko, it's all in your hands now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kissinger, Mr. Minister, it's a great honor and privilege to be here and to have you here. And if we have Spain-Portugal game in the evening, and if we have debate Kissinger-Sikorski in the morning, it can't be better than that. So now the dream team is in Warsaw. Great honor to have you here, sir. Please let me start with the phone issue, because you have asked one of the most famous questions in the history of diplomacy. Is there a single telephone I can call in Europe to ask what does the Europe think about something, what is going on in the world? But you have asked this question many decades ago. Do you think that now there is a single phone in Europe you can call to ask what does Europe think about something? And do we need a single phone in Europe?
Well, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is for me to be here. In my public life and also in my research on the nature of international relations, Poland, because of its history and because of its suffering and because of its heroism, has always played a very special role. And I will not forget coming here with American presidents under the communist period and to see the tremendous outpouring of the public that clearly could not be organized by the government because it was an assertion of freedom. And also when I was a professor at Harvard, there were some Polish students, several, especially from Krakow, who made a deep impression on me. So I'm very happy to be here. Now, on this notorious statement, does Europe have a single telephone number? I think it was actually invented by the Irish foreign minister describing a meeting with me, but I take credit for it. I'm not sure I actually said it, but it's a good statement, so why not take credit for it? There are two aspects. Is there a single telephone number? And secondly, what do you hear when it answers the telephone? Now we have a kind of a telephone number, but it isn't really absolutely clear if America wants to deal with Europe, who exactly the authorized voice of Europe would be, because there is Lady Ashton in the Commission, then there the other spokesman, and of course there are the national foreign ministers. But most importantly, on many issues there does not really exist a unified European, especially strategic approach. It's relatively easier now to get answers to technical questions. But I would say that even if a telephone exists, and even if they answer it, the answer is not always very clear.
Mr. Minister, what is the most important European telephone number in your mobile phone? If you have to make a phone call, what's the most common address?
Well, I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Council, which met only on Monday in Luxembourg. So obviously the chairman of that council, the High Representative Cathy Ashton, the head of our diplomacy. But I agree with Dr. Kissinger that it depends on the issue. On trade matters, Europe really does speak with one voice. And there we are a superpower. We are the largest economy on earth, and when we regulate Microsoft, Gazprom, we really matter because we speak with one voice. And the question is, before us Europeans, whether we want to use those economies of scale also in strategic matters. And I think we should, because what concerns the United States a great deal, the situation in the Middle East, for example, that is Europe's immediate neighborhood, where we have quite a lot of influence because we are a developmental superpower. But as you know, I would like us to go further. I would like us and this is actually official policy of the Cabinet of Poland, for the posts of the President of the European Commission and the President of the Council to be united, and for that person to be elected either by the European Parliament or even more broadly by the people of Europe. That office would clearly have the mandate and the legitimacy to speak for Europe.
Dr. Kissinger, do you think there is still a chance for Europeans to be a global superpower? Because if we are the largest economy on earth, definitely we are not the strongest superpower when it comes to the military. And we have a lot of problems. The next European summit is just ahead of us, and some people predict next financial Armageddon. So there is still a hope for Europeans to be a global superpower player?
also may I point out that our Polish hosts are carrying hospitality to considerable extremes by producing a foreign minister who speaks English better than I do. So now Europe as a superpower. The foreign minister is absolutely right. Europe, in terms of economy, population, and all the normal indices of power, has the capacity to be a superpower, to be equal to the United States or China or any other superpower that one can imagine. At the same time, we all know that one expression of power status is the military capacity of Europe is preposterously low in relation to what Europe used to do nationally. Now, we prefer to be in a world without weapons, but of course the ability of a country to bring about its objectives bears some relationship to its capacity to fight for them. And its capacity to fight for them really goes to a deeper point. Is a society willing to make sacrifices for its future? That is the key issue. And if one compares what Europeans wrote about themselves at the turn of the last century and what they write about themselves today, one has to say that the willingness to sacrifice in the present for the future has declined. So in that sense, Europe has the capacity to be a superpower, but Europe has neither the organization nor so far the concept to be a superpower. And that, for the European idea, is a challenge.
Mr. Minister, do you agree with this point of view?
Yes, because power cannot be just exercised in soft ways. Sometimes you need to back up your diplomacy with force. You can speak softly provided you carry a big stick. And if your partners know that there isn't a stick that you're holding behind your back, your capacity to influence events is less. And that is why Poland, during its presidency of the EU, worked so hard to improve Europe's capacity to act in the military sphere. And that is why we are in favor of launching permanent structured cooperation, which is to say the pooling of defense resources among willing members of the EU, with the hope that others will eventually join too. And I believe this would be welcome to the United States. I think a decade ago there were those in Washington who thought that it would undermine NATO, that it would somehow be a rival venture. I think today the US needs our help and would be pleased if we got our act together militarily.
Dr. Kissinger, you were kind enough to say about your positive impressions from Poland today, and you were writing in your famous book Diplomacy about the past of Poland in the 19th century, at the beginning of 20th century, about the Versailles Treaty, and for hundreds of years. Living between Germany and Russia was sort of a problem for Poland, and we used to be the most popular playground in this part of the world. Do you think that nowadays, living between Germany and Russia, maybe it's a sort of a blessing, not of a problem anymore?
Well, Poland chose a tough neighborhood to live in. And historically, it lived between an emerging Prussia and Germany and a advancing Russia, and it became the victim of these forces. But then it spent 100 years maintaining the idea of freedom with the extraordinary effort that in almost every war of liberation, anywhere in the world, there were some Poles fighting because they wanted to demonstrate the significance of the universal concept of freedom. I don't know any other country that has ever chosen that road and sustained it. So then, well, you know Polish history better than I do. Poland was resurrected at the end of the First World War. But in a strategically very unbalanced world in which the countries of Eastern Europe strategically were extremely vulnerable. And then that ended with another partition. So now Poland has to establish itself in the face of that history and in the face of the same neighbors. But conditions have changed. Poland is now relatively stronger than it was then. And hopefully, and actually, the intentions of its neighbors are somewhat different. The fact that Germany and Poland seem on the way to a substantial reconciliation is a new factor in that historic Polish equation. And Russia, too, is undergoing an evolution dictated by circumstances. One can never in Poland rely simply on sentiment and on mood. And so for Poland, one has to protect against the worst outcome in a more acute way than countries like the United States that are thousands of miles away. Some freedom of action can be achieved through skillful diplomacy. Some through belonging to larger structures. Some by seeing whether there is scope for altering historic relationships like that between Russia and Poland. But one thing is sure, the job of foreign minister in Poland is never boring. And so, and more than that, always has dramatic aspects and is always overlain with a consciousness of potential tragedy, which it is our duty to help prevent.
Dr. Kissinger has mentioned Polish-German reconciliation. I have a feeling now that half of our countrymen in the Euro tournament support Spain, but half of them support Germany, which is maybe the best symbol of reconciliation. Do you agree with that?
Well, that must have something to do with the fact that we have Polish players in the German team. But I would say that the job of reconciliation with Germany is pretty much done. We are now at a stage of consummating the actual Polish-German alliance. We are now treaty allies within NATO, and we are members of the same European family where we have daily business in all aspects, including the internal policies of both countries. So it's a very intimate relationship because Germany is by far our biggest trading partner, and we constantly negotiate European business. And so by getting involved in the business of Europe, Poland has found its bearings and found in Germany a worthwhile, and particularly under this German government, a friendly partner. It's harder with Russia because it's only recently that conditions are here that enable the truth-telling, which has to be the basis of reconciliation.
There were hundreds of books written about the decline of the West for the last 100 years. So if they were written in 1918 and we still exist, maybe it's not going to happen. But there are some visions that this century is not going to be the century of the Western civilization. What's your point of view on that?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
There are a lot of articles and books written about the decline of the West, that there are emerging superpowers that are going to replace Europeans and Americans as the leading power in the world.
The United States has had a very unusual experience in foreign policy. When we talk of foreign policy here, you automatically think of invasions, of defeats, of suffering, of restoration. America had never had any of these experiences, except the Civil War, which was sort of thought of as a domestic affair. Here's a country that through its history was separated from the rest of the world by two great oceans. So Americans genuinely believe that whether we participate in international affairs or not depends entirely on us. We can go in or out as we choose. I once gave a speech at the height of the Cold War in Omaha, Nebraska. That's right in the middle of the country. And in the question period, this was a bankers' convention. So in the question period, somebody said to me, "You talk of the danger of war and of the problems." He said, "But what could anyone want from us in Omaha?" The headquarters of the Strategic Air Command was 5 miles away down the road. The one city that was guaranteed to be attacked on the first day of a war was Omaha. But that had not penetrated the minds of the local people. Now this country, with that history, at the end of the war, emerged with 50% of the world's gross national product. Nobody has ever been in such a position. On top of it, we had an atomic monopoly. So for us, for you, the choices of foreign policy are to weigh nuances of how to deal with various gradations. For us, at that time, foreign policy was the allocation of resources, because any problem we recognized as a problem, we could deal with. So the main question was, did we recognize the problem or not? So compared to that position, we are certainly in decline, because no country could ever maintain or should ever try to maintain such a position. Europe was destroyed at the time. Asia was not yet independent. Russia was a threat, but in terms of capacity, not comparable to the United States. So now, in terms of that, we are in decline. But we still have 25% of the world's gross national product. So we are still the most powerful single nation in the world. But we now have to conduct foreign policy like other countries. We have to make choices. We have to establish priorities. And we have to establish a sort of strategic concept. Now, that's not easy in our country, because our country thinks of foreign policy as problems. So you get a problem, you solve it, and you can solve it in a limited period. In 1990s, President Clinton announced that we were getting involved in Bosnia and that we would solve the problem in 1 year. No European would believe that you can solve any Balkan problem in 1 year. That's, by European perspective, wasn't possible. So the drama in America now is to develop a strategic view of the world. I think we have enough resources to do the things we should do and to divide other things with other countries. But our tendency is to focus on one problem at a time. Right now, you would think the Middle East is Syria. In 3 months, it may be something else. So that's our problem. It isn't the problem that we've become weak. The problem is to develop a strategy for a period in which we still have greater capacities than anyone else.
Mr. Minister.
I agree that we need a strategy, and the strategy is likely to be more effective if America and a more integrated Europe work together. But I want to address your fundamental question, namely, are we or are we not in inevitable decline as the West? And I have to tell you, I'm torn on this question. Because if you look at the demographic figures or at long-term economic trends, it does seem inevitable that the West, Europe and America together, will continue to be relatively weaker, a relatively smaller proportion of the world's economy and the world's population. That's if trends continue. But the point is that trends don't always continue. If you look at the world 100 years ago. Europe, unfortunately, Poland was not on the map at that time, but Europe was indubitably on top of the world, and nobody could challenge us at that time. But then, if you look at the following 100 years until today, in 30-year slices, at each slice, the world looked completely different, because trends don't necessarily continue. And you can't exclude the fact that some of the current players that seem to be rising inexorably do not make the kinds of mistakes that we Europeans made in the 20th century.
Dr. Kissinger, I hope you are going to forgive me the question that may sound naive, but I think this is the question of millions of people around the world. When the US should intervene militarily, because the US intervened, as you have mentioned, in Bosnia, in Somalia, in Libya in some way, but not in Syria, not in North Korea, not in Iran. And
not in Syria.
Not in Syria. So when the US, in your opinion, should be engaged militarily in a conflict in a different part of the world? What's the rule?
Well, let me state my general view about intervening. The tragic debate in America over the past half century has been about interventions which we undertook with great enthusiasm and great unanimity of opinion, and which we ended with a domestic debate about how to withdraw. Now, you should not intervene so that you can withdraw. When you intervene, you must prevail. And if you don't know how to prevail, you shouldn't intervene. This, I would state, as a general principle. When I was in government, the administration in which I served inherited 550,000 Americans fighting in Vietnam, put there by the previous administration, most of whose members then joined the peace movement after they left office. So we had to fight our own people to continue what had been established. Now, therefore, when people say you have to intervene, I'm not in favor of military intervention in Syria. But we don't, because I can't describe what the end would be. I would like to see Assad removed. But that gets into a lot of, let's talk about the philosophical part. There are undoubtedly issues, such as the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which affect our security, everybody here, in which intervention may be necessary. There are other issues in which there are preferable outcomes, but it depends by what coalition they can be achieved. If Europe played a larger role in the region, then we could revisit this problem. So I'm not against intervention in principle. I am in favor of a concept for the West of what we're trying to do. Do it together, if at all possible, and intervene if necessary, but I don't want foreign policy conducted on the basis of tomorrow's headlines and driven by editorial writers.
Mr. Minister, I hope it's not a secret, but when you talk privately among ministers of foreign affairs in the European Union, do you usually think that Americans should be engaged more in the world affairs or less?
Before I answer that, I'd like to address the previous question. And I would make the following distinction. There are wars that are imposed on us, and we have to fight those. And then there are the wars of choice. And also, as the former defense minister, I agree with Dr. Kissinger that when we send troops into war, we have to give them the tools and the doctrine and the political circumstances in which they can do the job. It's unfair of politicians to ask soldiers to do things they were not trained for, such as, for example, creating states. The soldier's job is to prevail on the battlefield. And I'm uncomfortable with wars in which we fight with a country and with a nation just in order to get rid of its leader, as was the case in Iraq or in Libya, in fact. And we are not contemplating it, but in fact, as would be the case with Syria if we did. And that's why I think the new US method of striking directly by drones or by long-range missiles and terminating with extreme prejudice, as the expression goes, the people who are a threat to us, is actually a very cost-effective way of doing it, but we need to develop a legal doctrine about when it's permissible, because I have a feeling we'll be doing more of that sort of thing in the future. And as regards whether we should have more or less of the United States, it's not easy. When you're the top dog, you are always blamed, whether you do too much or whether you do too little. And that's just one of the burdens of leadership that the United States, I'm afraid, has to live with.
Dr. Kissinger, I want to get back to your answer. You said that it's wrong when politicians made up the decisions, thinking about the headlines in tomorrow's newspaper. But I think this is the most important question for us, for citizens of our countries today. Is it possible to make a different policy? 30, 40 years ago, maybe it was possible without 24-hour news networks. But do you know politicians now that think really about the future in terms of generations, not about headlines in today's newspaper or about the news program tonight? I mean, politicians with a clear vision for decades, not next day.
When I look at the politicians that I have known over a rather extensive period, I come to this view. It's often said in America and in Europe that for America and Europe to cooperate, you may need a strong Europe. And I agree with this. But if you look at the European leaders at the end of the Second World War, Adenauer, Schuman, de Gasperi, they reflected very weak countries, but they had vision of the future. And they had grown up in a Europe that still had confidence in itself. So they could, as leaders, strangely enough, act with more vision than you would deduce from their strengths. And in America at the time, we had this strange phenomenon of Truman, who with very little education but unbelievable instincts brought America along, and helped by Atchison and Marshall and so forth. But what do we have in the political world today, almost everywhere? The problem of getting elected is so complicated. And the problem of staying in office has so many aspects to it that many of the leaders are absorbed in managing the day-to-day issues. And so one could say there is less time available for reflective, long-range thinking, and maybe less confidence. That is a challenge of our period. But it's a question of the nature of democracy. It's not inherent in the objective situation. The key problem is whether one can subordinate the urgent to the important, and whether one society is willing to make sacrifices for the future. Now, Poland has shown greater willingness because its pressures on it are more immediate, and also because of a long history and particular culture. But that's what we have to work on in America. But even when you have made the criticisms of America that I've just made, you have to compare it that over a period of 50 years, without America, very little progress would have achieved. And while people can say we could have done more, we've also done quite a lot. And we have to keep that in mind when we are unhappy with this or that decision.
Mr. Minister, you know that people are complaining quite a lot about that we don't have leaders like De Gasperi, Schuman, Winston Churchill, or Margaret Thatcher, but maybe only in difficult times, only in tragic times we have leaders like that. What's your point of view?
I think it depends also on the manner in which we select them. If you select leaders in the multilateral manner, then, which is to say by consensus of nation states, then you usually appoint those people who have never stepped on anybody's toe. If you elect people by popular vote, then of course they tend to be more populist in the rhetoric, but you also get a chance to get characters who have more leadership qualities.
I want to start a completely different subject, but important for us in Poland, the shale gas. Do you think that it's going to change completely the energetic situation in the region and our position in Europe and in the world affairs, if we are going to use the shale gas, of course, in the next couple of years?
It's already doing so, even if it doesn't happen in Europe, and I believe it should, particularly in Poland. The US, from a projected importer of LNG, is becoming an exporter of LNG. This is already influencing global markets, not just for gas, but also for oil, because through heating there is an interconnection between the prices. And that, of course, will have profound effects, also geostrategic ones.
Dr. Kissinger, I think a lot of my countrymen were surprised that so many American companies were involved in shale gas operations in my country. Do you think it's really going to change the rules of the game in Europe if Poland would become quite important player in this market?
You're talking about
shale gas in Poland.
Shale oil problem. I look at this shale oil problem, first of all, from a global perspective. And let me give you a little, this example. When I first had responsible positions at the end of the 60s, the price of oil was about $1.50 a barrel. And the United States had surplus production. That enabled us. We had a system of regulating our production, which enabled us to regulate the world oil price, because if the price went above a certain level, we produced more. We had about 20% of our production shut in. This ended in 1971. And nobody understood what it meant. We went to full production, and we had an internal paper written in which it was said that by 1977, or something like this, the price of oil would be $5. By 1973, it went to $17, which was a lot of money at that time. So I've seen that curve develop. After that, the market was not made by the consumers. And the consumers had to be always worried about events that would drive up the price of oil. And the producers, through OPEC, could pressure the consumers. And that situation has more or less existed in the whole period since, affected only by dramatic events. But now the discovery of shale oil is changing the strategic situation. Not because of any policy we have, but the fact is, as the foreign minister correctly pointed out, in a relatively short period of time, say 3 to 5 years, the United States will be and can be, we may decide not to do it, but we can be an exporter of LNG. Or we can use it to modernize some of our industries, or both. And if you put together North America, Canada, United States, and Mexico, we will be self-sufficient in energy altogether. So that is a strategic change in the world situation. It may not become so apparent. We cannot be blackmailed that much or at all from previous producers. And the result of this, it will take a little bit to recognize it, just as it did in the 70s. But it gives America a greater freedom of action on Middle East questions. And it will change the dependence of countries on the United States. Now, if you add to it oil reserves in countries like Poland, and I said to it in Ukraine when I was there, this will then affect the distribution of energy in the region. It will take a bit to think through what new, it will undoubtedly produce new political patterns in the Middle East. And we need to think that through, and we ought to talk about it within the West. I'm describing the objective situation. I'm not saying we should do this or that. That's the situation that is emerging. And that creates a greater flexibility and a greater scope with respect to many problems we recognize.
Let me just add, I was in Baghdad on Sunday. Iraq has just surpassed its biggest ever output of oil. And once it's done so, it's actually now quite easy to increase it further. And they think they will double it within the next 3 to 5 years, which will put Iraq more or less on a par with Saudi Arabia. And the oil price is going down from a peak of 130 to, I think, 91 as of yesterday. So it's possible that after a decade of expensive oil, we are getting into a decade of cheaper oil. Oil price seems to go in cycles of about a decade. And of course, it's not guaranteed because it can be affected by political events. For example, by a war in the Middle East. And so the jury is still out.
That's very optimistic. For many years, Americans were complaining that you have to borrow money from Chinese to buy oil from Saudis. So it's not going to be like that forever. But I want to stop at China, because we don't talk so much about China in Europe, but definitely in the US. I just read the last issue of Foreign Affairs, and it's really hard to find a page without mentioning China. There are different visions that in 20 years, China is going to spend more for the military than the US, or in 30 years, the Chinese GDP will be higher than the American. What's your opinion on the future of China and the role China is going to play in the world affairs in 10 and 20 years?
You know, people talk of the rise of China as if it is a new phenomenon. But if you look at 1800 of the last 2,000 years, China was the most powerful country in the region. It's not a new country. It isn't just emerging. It is a country that is returning to its historic status. In the Chinese mind, they look at the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century as a period of humiliation, but as an exception to the rule. The Chinese description of itself in its books has been the Middle Kingdom. They thought of themselves as the center of the universe, but not in the nationalist way European sovereign states did, but in the sense of representing a culture that had a unique aspect. So as a result, the Western notion of the sovereign equality of states never existed in China. There were no words for it. In the Chinese world, until a very short time ago, the countries of the world were organized in the Chinese mind as tributaries to the Middle Kingdom. They didn't have to pay, they didn't have to be net contributors because they got gifts back, but their importance was judged by their relationship to the culture of the Central Kingdom, of the Middle Kingdom. So they had, right through the 19th century, China didn't have a foreign ministry until the last decade of the 19th century. So, at first, so when we say China should operate by rules that we have established, and it should take a minority position in a joint stock company, it's perfectly reasonable for us. It makes no sense. It doesn't fit into the way the Chinese think of international affairs. So the growth of Soviet influence in the Cold War depended on military power, and therefore to resist it, military alliances were formed. The growth of the Chinese impact on the world, it will have an element of military power, but it will be primarily based on political, economic, and cultural performance. And so it is a different issue. Now, when you say the GDP of China will increase, that's true. But you also have to consider that the per capita, that this has to be distributed about across a population 4 times larger than the United States. So even at the point when the GDP is the same, it will be per capita a quarter less. And then one has to think that Western people keep thinking of China as a projection in a straight line. Here is a country, and I'm saying nothing that I haven't said in China, and that the Chinese don't say about themselves. The coast of China can be compared to Europe. The interior of China can be compared to Africa. To develop a country through stages of development, it's unique in history. Nobody has ever done that. Within the next 10 years, the Chinese are moving 400 to 500 million people from the countryside into the cities. So what happens to people under those conditions? Nobody can absolutely predict. So you have new generations of Chinese emerging. All I'm saying is that this idea that the West is sort of sliding down and the Chinese are going in a straight line, it's not what the world will look like. I do believe it is important for the West and China to be in constant dialogue to see how this process can evolve in a way that is of benefit to the greatest number of people. Because it's a unique thing. It's never before happened. And if you add to it the issues that are arising, like nuclear proliferation and energy and environment, all of which are affected by what I have said and what you've said. So that's my view of the trend of China.
Mr. Minister, maybe it's only my impression, but I do believe that Americans talk and think about China much more than Europeans. Maybe it's our mistake.
Well, some European countries are extremely successful in exporting to China. We have just had the first visit of the Chinese premier in Poland in 25 years, first in Free Poland. And he confirmed the trend of meeting here in Warsaw with the entire region. President Obama did that 2 years ago, and Prime Minister Wen Jiabao did it recently. So I believe that our region can also be very attractive for China as regards investments and trade. But yes, Europe needs a more coherent strategy with China. But of course, there is a temptation for member states to cut individual deals with China. This is in fact the curse of Europe's foreign policy, that we agree something and then it's not, the discipline cracks up. I think with a country the size of China, put it like this, by comparison with China, we all in Europe are small countries, except that some of us know it and others are yet to learn it.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions to our guests, I hope they will be happy to answer.
Katarzyna Pisarska from the European Academy of Diplomacy. Dr. Kissinger, I have a question concerning a big elephant in the room, Russia. We spoke about future of Europe. You also said that there's a consciousness of tragedy in this part of the continent. If you were, I want to challenge you, if you were to be in Minister Sikorski's shoes, what would be the policy towards Russia?
I had trouble.
If you were in my job, what would be your policy?
What would you do with Russia?
I have trouble enough thinking about American foreign policy without giving detailed advice. What I have seen of Polish foreign policy, your fundamental objectives are clear. You try to assure your independence by being part of a larger grouping. You want that grouping to be as effective as possible. And at the same time, you recognize, or many of the Polish people that I know recognize, that if this can be achieved by reconciliation with Russia, you would be prepared to undertake it. That is my perception of what you're doing. And you're doing it in a very difficult neighborhood where many things are changing. That's more or less, I agree with this, and I have tried to support it. Now, I recognize that sometimes the United States goes further towards Russia than some Poles feel comfortable with. And that is the question. Sometimes we're wrong. But sometimes when we are right, we are trying to balance the need for a peaceful order with the need to make clear that there are limits. And that's not always an easy judgment. But that is the direction in which I think, on the whole, we and the Polish governments that I've known have tried to move. But sometimes one side or the other comes to a different judgment.
Bardzo proszę.
Thank you. Bartosz Wiśniewski with the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Kissinger, if Barack Obama is re-elected this November, what do you think should be the single most important foreign policy priority during his second term? If, however, we are in for a Republican president, what should be the focal point of his foreign policy? Finally, if you believe that the strategic priority that the US is facing is irrespective of who is in charge, what differences in approach would you expect depending on who is the president? Thank you.
The acoustics
What should be the number one on the agenda of the next US president, or if Barack Obama is going to win again? In foreign policy, what's the most important task for next US president?
Well, of course, it depends who wins the election. And the Republican candidate has stated some different objectives from the Democratic candidate, but as a fundamental principles, I mean, I have personally now worked with 10 American presidents in some capacity of both parties. So there are obviously differences, but objective reality imposes limits that you cannot just overcome by your own will. Now, I would think that for the United States, the immediate problem will be domestic. We will be in a very strange situation in November and December in the following way. We will pass no domestic legislation of consequence this year before the election. But between November 7th and December 31st, by law, we have to pass a tax bill and we have to extend the debt limit. That's unavoidable. This has to be done by a Congress, maybe 20 to 30% of whose members have already been voted out of office. So it's a very tricky situation. It will force some decision because it's unavoidable. But nobody can tell you today what that decision will be. Then after the election, we have to deal with the question of entitlements, of the debt, and so forth. So these are American problems that will preoccupy us. At the same time, I believe that any American president will now have to look at a world as I have tried to describe it here, of an America with great power, but not unlimited power, of a shift of some of the emphasis towards Asia, but the continued importance of an evolving Europe. So and assess the implications of the Arab Spring. I agree with the foreign minister. We cannot go and chase a revolution by chasing one representative in each case without knowing the underlying outcome. So any existing or new president will have to deal with these problems. But the good thing about America is that with all the problems I've described, it's an optimistic people. They think they can deal with them. And you may disagree, but it develops at some point tremendous energy behind doing things. So when I describe something to you, I describe a problem that I think we can solve. And those of us who've been in government, I've been with Republican administrations, but we work together with Democrats as long as it pursues a common objective. So don't let the fact that I have described difficulties lead to confusion. I look at them as potential opportunities.
Mr. Minister, you know American politics very well. Maybe that's the problem, that we in Europe or in the world think that Americans should do something internationally, but they do have enough problems on the US soil, and they will be involved in their domestic affairs for the next maybe couple of years, if nothing tragic is going to happen.
Well, foreign policy always has domestic constraints. It's constraints of public opinion, as we heard during the Vietnam era, but also resources constraints. What Paul Kennedy described in the 1980s as a possible imperial overstretch has happened, but with a twist. Namely, we have both in Europe and the United States a social overstretch. The state has grown too big and has incurred too many debts, and we have to fix them before we can again matter in foreign policy. Because, for example, as Europe, we are less effective. We've lost our soft power because of 3 years already of talk of the crisis of Europe. And I think the United States has a similar problem. There's gridlock in Congress, and the US needs to restore its vitality and the confidence of the world that it can finance its international presence.
Bardzo proszę.
Good morning, Joanna Becker, European Parliament. I have a question. As the European Union is at a crucial moment in its history, both in political and economic terms. Many experts say that apart from economic instruments and answers to the crisis, we need political ones. We need new leadership, and we need this strategic approach you've mentioned so many times today. And in this context, I would like to ask you about the cooperation of Poland, Germany, and France, specifically within the Weimar Triangle. Do you think that this cooperation, these countries, have the potential to create this strategic approach, to create a new momentum for the European Union, this new vision and concepts that you mentioned are needed? Thank you.
You know, I was once in America. I gave a dinner for the French foreign minister in a hall like this, with these acoustics. And he sat at one table and I sat at another, and we made toasts to each other. And there was a columnist the next day who wrote, it was a very interesting dinner. The French foreign minister declared war on the United States. And Secretary Kissinger thanked him for his brilliant exposition. And will you tell me what this lady was saying?
Yes. There is a triangle we do believe has its future. Germany, France, and Poland, Weimar Triangle. And we thought for a couple of years that it may be one of the engines of the European policy, but that's the question. Is there a future for cooperation like that between France, Germany, and Poland? Or maybe it's just our internal affairs? Or do you think that the cooperation like this, France, Germany, and Poland, that it can have some political power?
I think when Europe cooperates, it will, of course, have more political power than if it doesn't. And of these three countries, France and Poland have a historic link. Germany and Poland also have a historic link, but not always in the field of cooperation. So, but I must say, in the young German generation that I know, and for me now, everybody below 60 looks like a flaming youth. So in that generation, in the post-war German generation, I find a genuine desire for cooperation with Poland and perhaps more emotional attachment to cooperation with Poland than with almost any other country. So yes, it is possible and foundations for it exist. One still would then have to agree what the content of it is, but I would be very positive. I don't say this to the exclusion of Europe. That choice has to be made by my friend here, whether it should be France, Germany, and Poland, or a larger grouping, or France, Germany, and Poland within a larger grouping. That
Mr. Minister,
will happen. You don't want to be foreign minister when all problems are solved.
What's your vision of the future of the Weimar Triangle?
Well,
if there is a future.
It works. We meet at the prime ministerial, presidential, and actually ministerial and expert levels. And of course, there is a preponderance of resources. Poland, a little bit like China, had a bad 19th century, but is returning to its rightful place, is restoring its economic and political position. And Poland has I think, two attractive features that make it an interesting partner in Europe, particularly for France and Germany. Number one, we are an example of a successful economic transformation. And of course, we didn't expect that the lessons of the Polish transformation would be applicable to much richer countries in the Eurozone, but they are. And number two, Poland tries to represent the interests of the region. And therefore, it's useful to have Poland on board because you make sure that way that the interests of the new members of the EU are thereby taken into account.
Dr. Kissinger, one last question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, when you were living in Europe, in Germany, you were a football fan or maybe even a football player. Do you still follow soccer, if I may state, or just American football? Because we are all eager to talk about Europe this time.
I like American football and I follow it and baseball, but I'm very passionate about soccer. What we call soccer, and I have followed the Euro Cup on television. I went to see one game in Kiev, and to my sorrow, I have to leave tomorrow and can't see the game. I like soccer very much, and I've been to many World Cups and to many Euro Cups. I wrote an article once about how the national character was reflected in the style of the national football team and how you could tell something about the national character by the way football was played. This is no longer exactly right because there's developed such a universal style of football. But about 20 years ago, you could make. But I saw in the Financial Times before the last quarterfinal, they described the game between Italy and England, a fight between the bruisers and the schemers. These are not my words. I'm quoting the Financial Times. But if this is my last point, my last intervention, let me thank you all for coming here, for letting me come here. What I find exciting when I speak to Polish audiences is there is no cynicism. There is a belief that something needs to be done, that the problem is very difficult, and you're in a very exposed position. But you don't ask others to do it all for you. You feel you have to participate, just as the Poles who in the 19th century fought in every liberation struggle for the principle. And I've observed and read and met with your foreign minister, and I've seen the spirit in which this is done, but it's what I sense in this audience. You're not here to prove that nothing can be done. You're here because you hope something will be done and that you will do what you need to do. And for that, I'm grateful to you. Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. Thank you.
Thank you so much.